Hello, it's nice to be with you. For my monthly director's update, I want to talk with you about the role that mediation played within the threatened railroad strike that was eventually settled by President Biden signing a bill that Congress had passed imposing settlement terms on the 12 unions that negotiate with a variety of railroad companies. This is a case, and I'll try and illustrate it fairly quickly in our discussion, where I think mediation had some positive contributions, but it also, in some ways, failed to completely settle the issues. Just to remind you, what was going on here was contracts covering over 115,000 railway workers who belong to 12 different unions, and those unions have collective bargaining agreements that are well established. This is negotiations concerning renewals of those contracts that had expired at a number of the major railroad carriers. With the possibility of a strike looming, various provisions of the Railway Labor Act, which cover railroad workers, airlines, and some other transportation workers in the United States, were set in motion. And there was the creation of a presidentially appointed emergency board. But even more importantly, there was active mediation carried out by the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh, under the guidance of President Biden. And in that mediation, they strove to achieve a settlement that would be acceptable to both the railroad companies and those 12 unions. Well, through mediation, there was some success. They came up with a settlement terms that the railroad companies were willing to accept. But the glitch was that only 8 of the 12 unions were willing to accept and ratify that proposed settlement. It's not just a question of what the union leaders favored in those unions. The members of the unions also got to vote. And in 8 of the unions, the members ratified the proposed settlement. But in 4 of the unions, and those 4 unions actually represent a slight majority of the 115,000 workers, the workers, under the guidance of the leaders of those 4 unions, rejected the proposed settlement. So on the one hand, you had some success for mediation. You got a settlement that seemed to be favored by both the management side and a reasonable number of the unions and a sizable share of the workforce, but not complete success at all. The contentious issue, as you probably read about in the press, was the concerns expressed by union leaders in those 4 recalcitrant unions for the absence of paid sick leave. They were demanding 7 days of paid sick leave. And there were also other work-life balance issues, workers complaining they were under enormous stress because of workforce reductions and by rules that were unilaterally being imposed by management. Now, before I raise some questions about the settlement, let me also remind you about other elements of the settlement. There were rather favorable compensation terms. There was a 24% base pay increase over 5 years. There were 5 years of $1,000 each year lump sum payments. There was no increase in the healthcare copays that workers had feared management was trying to impose on them. In addition, there were just some other minor issues. Actually, I won't get into those that were included in the settlement. So again, the key was workers and unions who rejected that proposed settlement, and then eventually, just to remind you of the details, under the Railway Labor Act, Congress entered the scene by passing a bill imposing that negotiated settlement on all the unions, essentially extending the settlement that 8 of the unions had accepted to the 4 recalcitrant unions. Those unions and many other union leaders and supporters of President Biden and Secretary Walsh were enraged and argued that this was a betrayal by this president who, all along in his administration, you may have noticed, has been expressing strong support for collective bargaining. Okay, so here's the questions I have: is kind of what's really going on here? And I might say I don't get many answers on these questions from the press coverage that followed. I'm still somewhat lost in trying to understand what happened. So, for example, the questions I have is why did 8 of the union leaders and 8 of the union members find the terms acceptable, and 4 of the leaders and members in those 4 unions didn't? What exactly were they arguing about? Were some of the workers and the leaders just totally unwilling to accept anything short of 7 days of sick leave? No. One thing I did mean to mention: the contract did include 1 day of a personal day, not 7 days of sick leave, but 1 day personal day. So there was a minor concession there by management. But so again, why did some workers and union leaders accept the terms and others didn't? And even more importantly, why couldn't Secretary of Labor, I'm not blaming them personally, I'm just trying to understand what's happening. Why didn't Secretary of Labor, President Biden, others involved trying to mediate this settlement, come up with a settlement that all the unions and the workforce within them would have found acceptable? Now, management was saying that they wouldn't agree to the 7 sick leave days because they need control. They've been imposing more rigid work rules and scheduling and reducing manning levels. That was also angering the workforce, producing anger in among all the unions, not just those that didn't accept the settlement. And there, the issue that I also think looms in the background is management is often claiming they know best how to run things on the shop floor. They need unilateral control about scheduling, about workload and all. And I'm just not so sure that that's proven to be true. I mean, the management's claiming they know what's the most efficient solution is. And I want to bring to your attention some recent, really interesting research that's been carried out by a new faculty member at ILR, Alex Kowalski, who came to us after completing his PhD at MIT. In his thesis, Al looked closely at related questions within the warehouses of a company. And what Alex uncovered is that management in several of those warehouses insisted on unilateral control over work schedule, workload, work arrangement matters. But in some of the warehouses, management engaged with the workforce and came up with ways of addressing concerns about workload and scheduling that the workforce was much more accepting of. And the interesting evidence that Alex finds is that in those cases where the workforce had been engaged with management in coming up with acceptable work rules and all, that the productivity was actually higher. Now, another amazing result of Alex's, but it's not so surprising to us who have studied labor relations over the years, is that the lessons weren't being learned even within this single company. It wasn't the case that where there was effective engagement of the workforce and coming up with solutions that both sides were willing to live with and accept, and also solutions that appeared to lead to even higher productivity than in warehouses where management sustained unilateral control. Management wasn't learning. It wasn't learning from those more engaged work sites. It wasn't adapting its approach. And here again, I wonder if that's also going on in the railroad case. Again, we have management's assertion they need unilateral control, whether it's over sick leave and other work schedule issues and all. And I'm just not so sure we should assume that management knows best. But again, my bottom line point is that it looks like mediation by Secretary Walsh and others played a positive role in coming up with a settlement that at least was acceptable to management in several railroad companies and to the workforce and leaders within 8 of the unions. But mediation didn't completely succeed. I'm not blaming them. I just think it's pointing out there's You can do so much in certain situations, and at times, somehow mediation doesn't always fulfill its full promise. At the same time, I'm still wondering if there are any young researchers out there. I'd encourage you to think of this as a possible case study to go out and examine. Why is it that mediation only was partially successful in this case and not as successful as it might have been? Well, I'm still thinking about that question, and I hope you found my discussion of it interesting. Take care. Bye bye.